Return to Industrious Rogue, Part 3. We left off with the party having captured Prince Osman, the economy in freefall, and the mysterious Pact Masters moving to intervene. As it turns out, the Pact Masters were denizens of Lang themselves, and unknowingly to the party had contacted some of them for the whole flesh spawn business. So, as tempted to act as they were, they had the conflicting issues of facing the STC and potentially missing out on the deal to have a permanent and stable body for themselves. That is why 3 Pact Masters presented themselves to the party with a deal. They would not take any action against them, though they would have to intervene to fix the Katapeshi economy, in exchange for not just the bodies, but the compromise that no other denizen within Galarian would be granted such a treatment. They secretly planned to deal with the foreign denizen that had already arrived once the issue was sorted out. The Pact Masters each had an emerald of power that allowed them control over hundreds of alum, special types of brass golems that guarded the palaces, vaults, and markets of Katapesh. Dozens of which they had left hidden outside Saltspit, should push come to shove, so it shouldn't be too problematic now that they knew who he was. As much as they were kinsmen, they were all too aware that having any other denizen achieve such a feat would be problematic for their own plans, and if anything, holding such treasure in their power would grant them unimaginable influence far beyond the reaches of Katapesh. The idea was simply too tempting. Of the whole party, Valinar was the only one who had a reasonable measure of just how powerful the denizens were, and to him, the deal seemed reasonable given the current circumstances. Hassan, however, was not. He knew they were powerful and influential, but he just wasn't going to hand over their only bargaining chip. So after sending the prince into comfy incarceration and dispatching the denizens to their respective rooms while they discussed the situation, he devised a plan. Once he talked it out with the party, it was time to set it in motion. At sunset, Vorgok came to pick up the denizens and guide them through the underground passages to the laboratories. There, a group of apothecaries waited next to the vats where some previously selected flesh spawns had been placed. In silence, the denizens inspected the vessels, doing all sorts of nefarious and inscrutable planning within their alien minds. Suddenly, one of the denizens, the one who wasn't a Pact Master, makes an advance to try and get a hold of one of the spawns. These creatures have an unusual connection to each other that dates back to the times before their own multiverse collapse, and they were all keenly aware of the constant telepathic prodding they each tried to use on the rest in order to know what they were thinking. However, after thousands of years of depredating on each other, it didn't take a scion to know what was going to happen, and this particular denizen understood full well the disadvantage at which he was against with the Pact Masters. This led to a pretty heated battle between the denizens, during which the apothecaries got killed and most of the laboratory was trashed. At one point, the denizens abandoned their facades and went full-on abomination, fleshy tentacles and anemone mouths flashing all over the place. Vorgok just allowed them to fight, waiting for the perfect moment to call on Hassan. And that moment came when the Pact Masters attempted in panic to switch into the flesh spawns after the lone denizen managed to take a hold of their minds during the short pause they had to make to activate the Emeralds of Power and call upon the dozens of alum they had left parked in the desert outside Saltspit. The barbarian ran back, shut tight the heavy metal doors, trapping himself inside, mind you, and yelled at Hassan through the crystal ball he had brought with him. Above ground, things were nasty. Hassan had ordered some workers to open the discharge canals they used to clean Slimey's pool, in order to have the water current push the insane aboleth through the aqueduct, which also connected to the flesh labs. Valinar had gathered all the spellcasters he could that had even the slightest capabilities to fend off insanity, and they all rushed to the operation. Problem was that Slimey didn't fit, so they had to start demolishing the whole thing, which was taking too long, until one of the workers had the genius idea to use an explosive discharge on the base of the aqueduct. This would have been great, if not for the fact it ended with Slimey on his back splattered on the sand, with the lab still a good way ahead. Despite Valinar's spellcasting squad's best efforts, workers were already bleeding through their ears and trying to pull their heads off with a shovel. Slimey wasn't going anywhere. "Portals! We need to use the portals!" shouted Hassan to no one in particular. "I have a few at hand, but I can't teleport anything with safety unless I know where I'm aiming," answered Valinar. He asked me if he could try and teleport to the lab, but since he had not been there in a while, I couldn't ensure his high chance of success. Plus, he remembered the angry denizens inside, and quickly decided the option was not in his best interest. That's when Vorgok's voice came through the crystal ball. "Hey, priest, how about you stop making excuses and use the bloody glass thing?" He sounded like he was wrestling monsters down there, which pretty much he was. Valinar and Hassan exchanged looks for a moment, during which a tiny hint of guilt was briefly perceived, before the priest broke out a scroll and asked one of the surviving arcane spellcasters to use it on Slimey and aim through the crystal ball to get a precise destination. And with a puff of mystical energies, the aboleth was gone. The screaming, the voices, and worse yet, the images that came through the crystal ball were so horrible that the mage dropped it and shattered it into 1,000 pieces. But he did manage to see Slimey appearing next to Vorgok, and insanity becoming a thick, cloying, almost palpable substance down there. In the labs, Vorgok entered rage in order to fend off insanity, while the denizens, still locked in battle and fighting to get into the last remaining flesh spawns, went bananas. It is true that, back in the day, the party had managed to survive a long trip next to Slimey. However, quite a while had passed since then, allowing Slimey's ravaged mind to coalesce into the stuff of pure horror, feeding off of the madness that turned the minds of the bunkhouse prisoners into vanilla pudding. Also, when you're an interdimensional being of countless years, you have truly prime crafting material for nightmares in your head. Eventually, the denizens got themselves trapped in the flesh spawns, shaking in mental agony as Vorgok finished recreating WrestleMania on their original bodies. His rage rounds were running out. In Pathfinder, rather than having a specific number of uses for rage, the barbarian class gets a certain number of rounds he can spend in rage each day. So, the Ulfin hurried up, took the spawns off their vats and put them inside a metal box and ran away from the lab before Slimey could do his thing on him. Weak and unfinished as the spawns were, the denizens had managed to get themselves locked in pretty much useless bodies. While the nightmare fits made sure their mental capacity was occupied elsewhere, Vorgok ran to the deepest pits of the tunnel network, making his way around the place until he found the leftovers of an old trap puzzle they had encountered the first time they visited the place oh so many sessions ago, which consisted of some stone sarcophaguses with hidden pits, magical darkness, and guarded by mummies. He went to one of the coffins with the hidden pits while dancing around the now much less menacing local undead. He hurled the box to the bottom along with all the mummies he could find in the place and shut it closed with several stone slabs just before collapsing the room's pillars and running away. Things eventually calmed down. Most of the workers and spellcasters Valinar and Hassan brought with them had gone mad, but a quick call to the night hags solved the problem and at the same time increased the available nightmare pots. Vorgok refused to explain where he had sent the spawns, arguing everyone's safety, but insisted that they were securely trapped. Besides some deep cuts, tentacle marks, and a broken arm, he was in pretty good shape. The next few days were mostly devoted to taking Slimey out of the labs and sending him back to his pool. With the facility trashed and all those involved in the works dead, the party decided to close up the business venture. The surviving elves were sold to Al Sharangan after Vorgok had his way with them, and everything else was torched and the place collapsed. The whole deal was proving to be far more risky and problematic, particularly now that they had a better and more reliable source for profit. When they were taking out the elves, however, Jack stumbled upon the Emeralds of Power originally carried by the denizens, and decided to include them into his bling repertoire. Hassan took them from him about 10 minutes later. He had recognized them as quickly as he saw them, and he already heard the report regarding the considerable amount of alum that were waiting amidst the sands just a few miles out of town, probably brought there by the Pact Masters who seemingly planned on getting their request fulfilled whether the STC wanted it or not. After leaving some trusted advisors in charge of finishing up and organizing the reconstruction of the aqueducts, the party traveled to the outskirts of Saltspit, using the flying carpet to get a better view. Initially they were hard to find, brass against scalding sands and all that, but after some inspection, they found themselves floating above a legion of alum. A quick count put the number around 60. Valinar was speechless. Instant golem army was all he could muster. Rakim's player arrived that same session. He had been working on his character sheet to include the recent changes he had gone through. He was actually quite thrilled to play a mutant gorilla monk, truth be told, and now that things had calmed down, we took time to bring him back into the game. The party returned to the STC headquarters. Hassan and Jack went to meet up with the prince to shake him up and have him reveal how to properly use the Emeralds of Power. Vorgok went to the pit of prostitutes to check on the new wenching corporations to Saltspit, and Valinar headed down into the dungeons to check on Rakim. And he found him reading a treatise on wood carving. "Ah, we meet again, Valinar." The priest was startled by the image. A hulking, purple-haired gorilla with clever eyes, sporting a pair of minuscule glasses and instructing himself in the art of wood carving. He seemed both immensely peaceful and thoughtful. Rakim made a gesture to stand, and still nervous, Valinar attempted to control him through the brass rune. The monk made a short pause and then proceeded tapping his forehead. "I know what you did to me, Valinar, and what you can do, but as long as I keep my mind clear enough, I can fight it." Valinor regarded him with distrust. "Then why are you not tearing down these walls and choking me to death?" "Because I already tried that, and look where it got me." He regarded the priest with a bright gorilla smile. "I betrayed my vows and gave in to wild emotion. I forgot all I was taught, and the punishment for that was this." He scratched his head. "Perhaps it is a good opportunity to start over." "What about Fabala? She's dead, you know. It was horrible, bloody. The spawn, your son ate her from the inside out." Rakim tensed for a bit, then relaxed. After some appropriate will rolls, of course. "Terrible indeed, but I have to put it behind shall I ever get back in the way of self-improvement. Do not think of it as me forgiving you. I could never do such a thing. Think of it as me taking back control over myself." He leaned close to the bars. "Now, the door, if you would." I was pretty happy with how Rakim's player handled the whole situation, as it gave me a route with which to get the party working together again, something I was having problems figuring out considering all that happened. So I allowed him to resist Valinor's control as long as he managed to maintain a clear mind and suppress his emotions, as his character was ought to do from the start according to his own background. Noticeably shaking, Valinor took a while to take the step and open Rakim's cage. The gorilla would have had no problems opening it himself anyway. Getting the information out of the prince proved far easier than expected. He mounted his whole non-cooperative setup at first, but he broke down quickly after Hassan threatened to bury him alive in salt. As it turned out, each emerald had a word of activation inscribed inside, which could be read if put under light at the correct angle. Once pronounced, the wearer would gain full control of the alum, bound to the gem through a telepathic link. Ignoring the prince's demands for better wine, Hassan and Jack walked out and took the flying carpet to check on the alum again. Jack took an emerald and Hassan the other two, and after some careful inspection, managed to get the words, which they uttered as they flew above the brass golems. One by one they came to life, as the whole brass battalion pointed their glowing emerald eyes up in their direction. It was decidedly unsettling. A nearby traveler hurried away with his camel. Hassan was awestruck with their newfound power. "Imagine all we can do with this. We could bring Katapesh to its knees." "Indeed," said Jack, pensive. "But what if?" He closed his eyes for a moment, thinking, focusing his mind, and then a third of the alum began dancing the thriller. After the appropriate slapping, we spent part of that session setting things straight. I told the party that their contacts in Katapesh informed that the remaining Pact Masters had enough of their jibba-jabba and were about to mount an attack on Saltspit, so they gathered to plan a defense. Having 60 alum would indeed prove useful, but considering the Pact Masters probably had a lot more in their service, plus a myriad of other means ranging from angry Katapeshi nobles to nefarious devices no one knew about, so 5 dozen brass golems just weren't going to cut it. They tried to get the night hags to chip in, but as expected they refused to do anything outside of their contract, particularly since all the trouble they had stirred in Katapesh had ended up affecting Bin Fashar's business and, in turn, were causing issues on the extraplanar Nightmares to Souls to Gems deal. The Brass Legion took some extra cash to prepare, but the party knew they wouldn't add much more than a barely loyal meat shield. Al-Sharangan got some of his own men involved, and through militia recruitment, they managed to get a few hundred highly unreliable hands. The forges were put to work double time in order to make the equipment for the Saltspit Defense Force, or the SDF, and the markets were depleted of all swords, hammers, helmets, butter knives, and peeing pots. Baba Ganoush of the Spellcasters Union was convinced to get his magic users organized into an arcane militia in exchange for a sizable payment bonus. The Slave Masters clique also got its own bonus after negotiating the involvement of its members in the SDF. After all, some of the meanest inhabitants in Saltspit worked there. The slaves tried to organize themselves into the Brotherhood of Involuntary Workers and to get a deal out of the whole matter. But a pack of angry gnolls was set loose in their quarters to sort things out. And speaking of gnolls, some of the marauding tribes the company used to hire for muscle jobs were brought in as well. All in all, the SDF managed to become a rather respectable army, counting around 1,500 footmen, 60 golems, about 90 spellcasters, 300 gnolls, a few dozen hyenodons, a handful of trained harpies, 5 hill giants, and a bunch of resourceful PCs. Yet, when the Pact Masters arrived in the company of every single alum in Katapesh, some 300, including a couple of giant ones that everyone always thought were just statues standing in front of the Pact Masters' minarets, as well as a battalion of mercenary Batezu led by a fallen angel, it somehow felt small. Besides Vorgok, who was barely stopped from charging alone, the party wanted to negotiate a way out. However, there was no room for niceties. Though the Pact Masters were unaware of what exactly had happened, they had managed to receive warning signals from their associates before being trapped in the flesh spawns. Worse yet, they believed the STC to be in league with other denizens of Leng, which made the whole thing crystal clear. They had been trying to undermine Katapesh from the very beginning in order to strip them of their power. So, the STC had to be wiped out. Jack and Rakim volunteered to approach the Pact Masters on the flying carpet to attempt a deal, getting ambushed by devils when they got too close. After getting sight of that, Vorgok charged away, and after some hesitation, Hassan gave the order to attack. I remember Valinar's player being rather troubled, saying that they were going to lose all they'd worked so hard for. So yes, the table was rather grim that session. We ended it in a cliffhanger, as it was getting late, and the battle would surely take a while. One of the reasons I like to stop sessions on cliffhanger sometimes is to both give everyone a sense of tension and to make them eagerly await the next meeting, and to give them time to think. So I tend to do it mostly when I know they're in big trouble. This case was no exception. The next session, Hassan and Jack asked me about the fallen angels, and we talked about how they ended up like that after betraying their calling and becoming compelled by the burden of sin to act as they do. Next, Jack used some bardic lore regarding Mercurial waters and whether they could cleanse really ugly sins, to which I said yes. From that point, their plan was rather evident. On a seemingly unrelated topic, prior to starting the session, Hassan also asked about what happened at the conjunction of the quasi-elemental plane of vacuum and the negative energy plane. I recalled about how the place was supposedly known as the point where death and nothingness meet, how the Doomguard Planescape faction had erected their most fearsome fortress precisely in the last point before that place where something could exist, and how it effectively meant absolute and utter oblivion. When we finished that conversation, I had the nagging feeling he didn't just ask me out of pure curiosity, but the plan wasn't so obvious to me. So Jack and Rakim spent the first part of the session fighting through progressively more horrible devils on their flying carpet. The monk had become considerably stronger after his gorilla-fication, and he was smashing skulls left and right, while Jack made use of the skill points spent in fly to get the carpet moving swiftly among spiky chains and horned monstrosities. Eventually they made their way to the Batezu's leader, an appropriately edgy fallen angel with excessive use of eyeliner. With Jack orbiting him as fast as he could to avoid his spells, Rakim took the Mercurial water and used his hugely powerful gorilla legs and absurdly high acrobatics roll to propel himself through the sky and land a choking grip on the fallen angel, smashing the vials on his head and letting the water take his sins away. Lots of hissing, screaming, and falling took place in a short period of time. He managed to get a hold of himself just to avoid smashing against the desert ground. After some emotively cheesy speech, the redeemed angel looked over his army of devils and gave his life to sever the link that held them in this plane, sealing the wobbles between dimensions and instantly dissipating the entire Batezu force. While the alum kept fighting, and, in truth, they were winning with or without the devils, the sudden dimensional blockade left the Pact Masters wavering, to which Jack quickly reacted and shot the carpet in their direction. Slish slash, some gorilla fist to the face, and their emeralds were all taken, sending the alum army into a sudden halt. It took some seriously lucky saves and fly rolls for them to avoid most of the spells furiously thrown their way by the Pact Masters. But once they managed to get behind their lines, a flurry of fireballs and magic missiles coming from the spellcasting battalion covered their asses. Without waiting any longer, they checked for the words carved into the gems and began calling them out, rapidly gaining control of the Pact Masters' alum army and sending them in their direction. One of the colossal alum got a hold of one of them and squished it against the ground, only to be repeatedly stomped by hundreds of brass feet afterward, while the rest managed to escape inside a tornado of sandy wind. An eerie silence swept over the battlefield, as in a matter of minutes all the enemies had disappeared. Some drunken Brass Legion mercenaries were fighting between themselves, but otherwise everyone felt rather out of place. After gathering his thoughts, Hassan just waved a hand and told Whipmaster Concaf to sound the horn and send everyone back home. Payment will be handled at the House of Public Services tomorrow morning. Order all the taverns and wenching houses in the city to make their products freely available for the night, at the expense of the Saltspit Trading Company. Latrines will be open service to anyone in need. The Saltspit Defense Force is dismissed. Valinar announced, shouting his lungs out, which drew a multitude of cheers and happy chants from the army. After some celebration, the party went straight into planning their next move. Sure, they had beaten the Pact Masters in open combat, and while they managed to kill one of them and held 3 more locked away somewhere deep beneath Saltspit, there were still 6 more of them alive, and most likely plotting a new way to get back at them. Both Hassan and Valinar argued that the most reasonable step was for the Pact Masters to use Katapesh's resources to undermine them somehow. Another direct attack was very unlikely, considering the STC was now in control of every single alum the city ever had, and that besides the city and Zephyr guards, the trade nation had no proper standing army to speak of. Vorgok deemed it a logical outcome, and proposed to lay siege on the city and force the merchant court to submit and remove their support to the Pact Masters. Hassan also argued that it was reasonable for them to once more attempt to hire the help of devils, which after all they defeated through a very circumstantial and unlikely to work again strategy. So they decided to prepare for both scenarios and began planning. The first thing they focused on was the eventuality of the devil mercenaries coming back, since it seemed both the quickest and most dangerous way in which the remaining Pact Masters could react to their defeat. Having seen what a few vials of Mercurial water could do, Hassan figured out that a lot more of the same could effectively stop any army made out of evil outsiders. To that end, they moved their contracts and informants in order to hook up with someone who could make a pathway into the 7 mounting heavens of Celestia, from where the water in question originated. One such individual was found in Absalom, the city at the center of the world, to whom they offered ridiculous amounts of money in exchange for the magical mirror he had that could be used to walk back and forth between the lowest level of Celestia, Lunia. It so happens that all portals leading to Celestia do so precisely on the shores of the Silver Sea, the endless expanse of quicksilver waters that surrounds the base of the mountain. Hassan's plan was to use the mirror in order to pour a continuous stream of mercurial waters into Galarian, into a massive cistern they had ordered built using one of the old tunnels of the salt mines. However, since the portal opens specifically on the edge, water doesn't just flow in. So, they decided to hire some craftsmen from Alkenstar to get them a pump system that could do the job. As previously mentioned, teleportation doesn't work in Alkenstar due to the city being in the middle of the Mana Wastes, a huge expanse of anti-magic territory between Nex and Geb, resulting from an ancient war between those two nations. However, having the flying carpet made travel considerably easier, and within less than 2 days, they were in the City of Invention. First thing was to revisit the golem purchase. You know, I love golems, but don't we already have almost 400 of those back home? Asked Valinar. Yes, but those are brass golems. I need iron golems, like we ordered, answered Hassan. Valinar gave him an intrigued look. Why? Because I need them in orbit. Hassan dramatically removed his eye patch, revealing his golden eye. We will rule Katapesh, nay, the world, from the very skies above, and there will be no one to stop us. I don't know if he'd been planning it all along or not. I mean, yeah, a lot of sessions had passed between Hassan getting his eye replaced by a gold replica, and the one where he revealed his orbital golem plan. But these guys tend to play like that. I guess it's the benefit of knowing our campaigns tend to last for years, so even the most far-fetched schemes can be brought into fruition eventually, with enough patience. So, after a good 10-minute laugh, we went along with the game. As it turns out, the craftsmen in Alkenstar had already gathered all the materials needed to build the golems when they heard the news the payment was underway, but stopped production as soon as they were informed of the assault on the Golden Caravan. Hassan ordered the workers to start at once, which wasn't hard once some good intimidation rolls and some sacks of gold were thrown in the face of the head craftsman. Payment would be secured this time by using Alkenstari flying ships, and the SDC would pay a 10% bonus to cover for the distress caused by the last incidents. They were allowed to purchase 3 iron golems already built, which were meant to guard a vault in Druma. Then came the matter of the Mercurial pump system, which hydromechanics from Alkenstar could easily solve if they were handed direct access to the Silver Sea. The engineers made some quick schematics and calculated that, if the celestial liquid behaved similar to actual water, and taking the size of the mirror into consideration, they could guarantee a flow of 2 cubic meters per second, or roughly 530 gallons. So the party rented a skyship, loaded the iron golems, the engineers, a working crew, and some ingots of anti-magic metal, just in case, and headed back to Saltspit. I told them things would be calm for the next 2 months, so we fast-forwarded the events. Construction of the Mercurial pump went along nicely. Though there had been some issues at first due to constraints of sending the materials through the mirror, the engineers eventually figured out how to cut them down and rearrange them on the other side. A redundant pumping station was built on the shores of the Silver Sea, along with the pipework necessary to carry the water. Tests showed that the Mercurial water was lighter than regular water, so the pumps would be able to increase the flow by almost 30%. Some dredging had to be done to clear the area, disturbing some of the local wildlife, but besides some curious lantern archons and some adorable celestial bunnies, the works carried on without interruption. On the other side, the cisterns had been completed, and Hassan had another one built just in case. It would be able to hold 27,000 cubic meters, and another pump station was built in order for Mercurial waters to be injected into a special pipe network that connected to spray towers placed in strategic locations around the city. The idea was that should any kind of evil entity happen to pass by, the water cannons on these towers would be able to rain goodness all around. Rakim advised testing in advance, so they paid off some mercenaries to capture evil harpies and salamanders from the brazen peaks, as well as a mummy they dug up from the temple underneath. After showering them with mercurial water, they either turned good and started hugging everyone, or hissed in pain and melted down. In any case, it did exactly as advertised. In the meanwhile, Vorgok gathered a group of the toughest Brass Legion men he could muster and headed on an expedition into the screaming jungle in eastern Sargava. He still remembered the horrible and enormous shapeless thing covered in teeth that spat other shapeless things covered in teeth he had discovered during his time as the Pain Fairy, and he had all intention of building a battle arena with that thing, or at least throw it on the Pact Masters should they come back. Teleportation could only get him so far, as casting powerful spells in the Morangi territory could anger the wrong guys. So he took the skyship and spent the next 3 weeks flying above or cutting through the jungles, tigers, talking apes, and juju monsters. Eventually, though, they made it through and using the last bits of terror dust managed to track the aberration, which was hidden at the bottom of a temple dedicated to a forgotten blood god. After literally wrestling the horror down, Vorgok cut it into manageable pieces, locked them inside steel boxes, and loaded as many of them as he could into the ship. The barbarian had noticed the creature reformed whenever he or his men cut it down, so he figured it would be able to patch itself up once they unloaded it back home. Back in Saltspit, workers had been turning the deepest slave pit into a battle arena. The poor sods that had lived there had been sent to the pit next door, which was so crowded now people died in their sleep from being suffocated. And the slave masters had so much problems moving them through, they ended up building a ramp and throwing slaves inside, then picking them up with a series of cranes and nets. Human resources at their finest. So when Vorgok returned, they hauled the boxes inside. The arena itself was not finished, but they had already converted some of the tunnels into holding pens deep enough that Vorgok hoped to be able to contain the monster. So one by one, he stood on the edge of the holding pen, opened the boxes with a hammer, and quickly tossed the gargling monstrosities inside, which began fusing with each other as they piled up. Rakim showed up and asked Vorgok if it wouldn't be safer to keep the parts separated rather than recreating the massive monster right in the middle of the city. The barbarian thought it a capital idea, so he jumped into the holding pen and wrestled the thing into submission once more, chopped it down, and boxed it back up. After the workers had finished preparing some more pens, he divided the boxes in 5 groups and left the contents evenly split. 5 large horrible abominations were easier to contain than one enormous one, after all. Once it became operational, the arena became a centerpiece of Saltspit, gathering huge crowds to witness the always bloody and spectacular encounters. Hassan pressed for the income generated from bets to be destined to the Department of Public Works, which, among other things, devised primitive sewage systems for the city that drained directly into the horror's pit. As they found out, that thing consumed pretty much anything thrown at it. As long as they kept burning it partially once a week, they could avoid it growing out of control. Eventually, a garbage and rubble disposal facility was erected next to the arena, with everything from broken tools to dead bodies being handed over to the Monsieur Mangatout, as they eventually named the thing. Vorgok supposedly could differentiate between all 5 versions of Mangatout, but I wasn't quite convinced. This led to the creation of a garbage collection crew, which had both the task of cleaning up the city and regularly setting Mangatout on fire, which substantially increased Saltspit's life quality and rate of disappearing bodies. With the city swelling at continuously faster rates ever since Katapesh went into economic crisis and immigration exploded, even the generally careless STC saw it necessary to start giving the place some kind of infrastructure. The Department of Public Works was given a budget of 400,000 gold pieces per month. Assuming at least half of it would be stolen somewhere in the chain of corruption, 200,000 gold pieces seemed to be enough to get the place running smoothly, and then some. Streets were getting paved, a public hospital was built, and put in charge of the Church of Desna. The Brass Legion got a permanent headquarters made of actual stone with more latrines than anyone could ever need, and there was a brief experiment about using the noxious fumes from the sewers to empower a gaslight system. But after setting an entire neighborhood on fire, it was determined that simply hiring torchbearers to light up heavy lamps during nighttime was more effective. By this time, the coinworks managed to reach full capacity, the equivalent of 800,000 gold pieces per day being processed. Due to the logistical complications of minting so many coins, most of it was poured into molds and set into 10-foot-tall blocks of solid gold, which was then transported to the vaults beneath the palace. At 16,000 pounds of gold per day, though even the most enthusiastic estimations grew short, There was simply too much money being produced, and increasingly less room to keep it. I remember asking the group if they really cared about keeping it all safe, considering they had a virtually infinite supply. The looks they gave me clearly indicated the scale of their greed, so plans to build a monumental vault system were laid out almost immediately, including a flooded section for gondola trips. As wondrous as the vault plans were, they would still need some serious protection. Valinar had the idea of binding outsiders to act as guards. The first attempt was a disaster, accidentally letting loose a demon with too many G and Z's in its name to be pronounceable, which they managed to stop by showering it with a bucket of mercurial water. The demon melted down into a humanoid form that, among tears, could not stop thanking the party for washing away its sins, and pledged its life to their service should they choose. The cha-ching thoughts in Hassan's head were almost audible. We're so monetizing this right now. The idea didn't take long to convince the rest of the party. They would use the mercurial waters pumped out from Celestia in order to wash away the sins of petitioners turned into devils and demons, and then take advantage of the renewed remains to see what they could get out of them. Hassan had originally intended to charge them, but it was soon evident they would probably have nothing to pay with, and it was unlikely that devils and demons would willingly pay in advance to be reduced into joyous leftovers. Instead, Valinar noted they would have to aim at something else, such as the pledge offered by the one they washed earlier. Who knows, maybe they'd get lucky and find a long-lost archmage or something. Rakim guessed that the waters would probably not work on particularly powerful ones, harming them rather than saving them. Given that not all evil entities were originally good, some arising from evil itself, so they would have to keep their clientele on the lower tiers, which made the whole affair seem less interesting. "We're not in the business of saving souls," said Hassan. "We're in the business of making business." But just when he was about to scrap the idea, Valinar lit up. But there may be someone willing to pay precisely for that. This concludes part 3 of the amazing story of the Industrious Rogue and his party. Stay tuned for part 4. Tell me what you think in a comment down below. Before we take our leave, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, All Things D&D. Stay tuned for more amazing Dungeons & Dragons content every week.